This video is audio content only. It does not contain any visual footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. Welcome. Today, we explore one of paleontology's most intriguing mysteries, the Paleocene dinosaurs. While the asteroid impact 66 million years ago is often seen as a final curtain, controversial evidence suggests some giants may have survived. We'll journey through the apocalyptic KPG transition, examine fossils that challenge the extinction timeline, and witness the rise of the mammalian successors that followed. Join us as we investigate whether the Dinosaur Dynasty truly ended in an instant, or if their final embers continue to flicker at the dawn of a new era. Chapter 1. The Sudden Silence of the Mesozoic Giants. Chapter 1. The Sudden Silence of the Mesozoic Giants. The transition from the Cretaceous period to the Paleocene epoch represents the most dramatic turning point in the history of life on our planet. For over 150 million years, the Earth was a realm of giants. From the massive, long-necked sauropods that shook the ground with every step, to the apex theropods like Tyrannosaurus rex that dominated the northern continents, non-avian dinosaurs were the undisputed masters of the terrestrial world. The air was filled with the leathery wings of pterosaurs, and the oceans were patrolled by sleek predatory mosasaurs and long-necked plesiosaurs. This was a world of high-energy ecosystems, driven by a warm, stable climate and a vast diversity of life that seemed invincible. Then, in an instant of geologic time, the silence fell. The catalyst for this sudden silence was a cataclysm of unimaginable proportions. Approximately 66 million years ago, a massive asteroid, measuring between 10 and 15 kilometers in diameter, hurtled through the atmosphere and slammed into the Earth. The site of this impact was the Yucatan Peninsula in what is now Mexico, creating the massive Chicxulub crater, a scar over 180 kilometers wide. The energy released upon impact was equivalent to several billion atomic bombs detonating simultaneously. The immediate consequences were apocalyptic. A massive heat pulse radiated outward from the impact site, incinerating everything for thousands of kilometers. Giant tsunamis, some reaching hundreds of meters in height, surged across the Gulf of Mexico and into the interior of the continents. Earthquakes of unprecedented magnitude, estimated at magnitude 10 or 11, buckled the crust, sending seismic waves rippling through the planet's interior. The timeline of the atmospheric recovery was a grueling gauntlet for the survivors. While the initial heat pulse was fleeting, it was followed by a period of freezing temperatures that gripped the globe for roughly 3 years, as the dust and aerosols reflected the sun's warmth back into space. As the dust slowly cleared, the chemical legacy of the impact remained. The sulfur vaporized during the collision combined with moisture in the atmosphere to form sulfuric acid. This resulted in a decade of corrosive acid rain that fell upon the land and into the oceans, devastating vegetation and acidifying the surface waters of the seas. In the oceans, this environmental assault led to a Strangelove ocean, a state of extremely low biological productivity. The most striking evidence of this collapse is the total shutdown of the vertical carbon isotope gradient. In a healthy ocean, the surface waters are enriched with carbon-13 compared to the deep sea, a result of the biological pump, where organisms at the surface fix carbon and eventually sink. Following the KPG impact, this gradient vanished entirely, indicating that the cycling of carbon between the surface and the deep sea had effectively stopped. This state of biological stagnation persisted for hundreds of thousands of years, leaving the oceans quiet and empty of the diverse plankton that once fueled the marine food web. The fossil record provides a stark testimony to this catastrophe in the form of the KPG boundary. This thin band of clay is uniquely enriched with iridium, a metal rare in the Earth's crust but common in asteroids. Along with iridium, this boundary contains shocked quartz, grains of sand physically deformed by the intense pressure of the impact, and tiny glass spherules called microtectites. Below this line, the world is full of dinosaur fossils and diverse Cretaceous flora. Above it, they are conspicuously absent. The extinction event followed a generally accepted pattern where no terrestrial animal larger than about 25 kilograms managed to make it through the bottleneck. The great non-avian dinosaurs, with their high metabolic demands, were completely eliminated, along with the pterosaurs and the giant marine reptiles. Even for the species that survived, the immediate aftermath was a time of profound struggle characterized by the Lilliput effect. Named after the tiny inhabitants of the fictional island in Gulliver's Travels, this phenomenon describes the significant and widespread decrease in the body size of surviving species immediately following a mass extinction. From terrestrial invertebrates to marine echinoderms like sea urchins, the fossil record shows that the individuals living in the shadow of the catastrophe were often mere fractions of the size of their ancestors. In a world with nearly non-existent primary productivity and a shattered food chain, being small was a vital survival strategy, requiring fewer resources to maintain a viable population. The survivors were those organisms that were small, hardy, and capable of adapting to a world of detritus. Small mammals, often burrowers or generalist feeders, were uniquely suited for this new reality. Birds also made it through, though the fossil record suggests a heavy bias toward specific groups. The survivors were primarily ground-dwelling species with shorter tails compared to their long-tailed, tree-dwelling non-avian relatives. As the global wildfires decimated the world's forests, the arboreal niches vanished, leaving only the terrestrial, seed-eating lineages to carry the dinosaurian legacy forward. Other survivors included ectothermic reptiles like crocodiles and turtles, whose low metabolic rates and aquatic lifestyles provided a buffer against the atmospheric changes occurring on land. As the dust and aerosols finally settled and the sun began to shine again, the world that emerged was a haunted version of its former self. The great forests were gone, replaced by a landscape dominated by ferns. This fern spike, recorded in the fossil pollen and spores found immediately above the KPG boundary, represents a planet in the first stages of a long recovery. Ferns are often the first plants to colonize areas devastated by disaster, and for a short period at the beginning of the Paleocene, they were the primary greenery on a quiet, desolate expanse where only small creatures scurried through the undergrowth. The biodiversity of the Earth had been cut by 75%, and the rules of the Old World had been permanently erased. This was the beginning of the Paleocene epoch, a 10-million-year interval of recovery and reorganization. It was a time of old, recent life, where the remnants of the Mesozoic world struggled to find their footing in a new environment. While the generally accepted narrative suggests a clean break at the KPG boundary, a persistent question has lingered in the minds of many paleontologists. Was the extinction truly as sudden and total as it appears? While the vast majority of evidence suggests that non-avian dinosaurs perished 66 million years ago, there have been tantalizing and controversial reports of fossils that seem to defy this timeline. In certain corners of the American Southwest, the rocks tell a story that threatens to upend the traditional understanding of the Mesozoic's end. These discoveries suggest that the sudden silence may not have been as universal as the global boundary layer implies. If these reports are accurate, it would mean that the transition between the age of reptiles and the age of mammals was not a sharp cutoff, but a complex overlap where the last of the giants lingered in the shadows of a recovering world. This mystery sets the stage for a deeper look into the specific evidence that has sparked one of the most intense scientific debates in modern paleontology. Could the embers of the Dinosaur Dynasty have continued to glow in the dawn of the Paleocene? Chapter 2. The Alamoan Fauna. A challenge to extinction chronology. The San Juan Basin, a vast geological depression stretching across northwestern New Mexico and into southwestern Colorado, serves as the primary stage for one of the most provocative debates in modern paleontology. This region is a rugged landscape of high deserts and eroded badlands, where the layers of the earth are peeled back to reveal a history that spans millions of years. Within these layers lies a rock unit known as the Ojo-Alamo Sandstone, a formation that has become the center of a scientific firestorm. For decades, the conventional wisdom held that the non-avian dinosaurs vanished entirely at the end of the Cretaceous period, leaving behind only their avian descendants. However, the discoveries made within the San Juan Basin suggest a different possibility, that a diverse group of dinosaurs may have crossed the threshold into the Cenozoic era, surviving for hundreds of thousands of years in a world that was rapidly changing around them. The primary proponent of this theory is James E. Fassett, a USGS emeritus researcher who has dedicated decades to studying the stratigraphy of the basin. Fassett's work suggests that the extinction was not the universal, instantaneous event described in the 25-kilogram rule. No terrestrial animal larger than 25 kilograms survived the KPG extinction. Yet, the evidence from the San Juan Basin points to the existence of the Alamoan fauna, a diverse group of large-bodied survivors that persisted until approximately 64.5 million years ago, a full million years after the asteroid struck the Yucatan. The heart of this controversy lies in the precise age of the Ojo-Alamo sandstone and the fossils it contains. This formation is a complex mix of sedimentary rocks, ranging from coarse conglomerates to finer-grained shales. For many years, it was simply assumed to be Cretaceous in age because it contained dinosaur fossils. In the early 20th century, the presence of dinosaur remains was considered an absolute marker of time. If a rock had a dinosaur in it, it had to be from the Mesozoic. But as scientific techniques became more sophisticated, researchers began to notice discrepancies. Other lines of evidence, particularly from the world of ancient plants and mammals, started to point toward a younger age for the Ojo-Alamo. One of the most powerful tools in this investigation is palynology, the study of ancient pollen and spores. Because different plant species evolve and go extinct at known times, their pollen acts as a microscopic clock. When researchers sampled the Ojo-Alamo sandstone at various localities, they found that the rock samples consistently yielded assemblages of pollen and spores characteristic of the Paleocene epoch. Even more startling was the discovery that these Paleocene plant markers were found stratigraphically below dinosaur fossils. In the northern San Juan Basin, a coaly shale bed located 12 meters above the base of the Ojo-Alamo was found to contain undisputed Paleocene pollen. Just 3 meters above this layer, researchers recovered a massive hadrosaur femur. This evidence is not limited to New Mexico. Fassett has also cited the Animus Formation in Colorado as containing Paleocene dinosaur fossils. In these deposits, the presence of Paleocene fossil leaves and palynology provides a consistent temporal framework that places dinosaur remains firmly within the Cenozoic. The implications are profound. These animals were not only present during the new era, but were living in an environment already populated by a post-extinction flora. The Ojo-Alamo is often found in close association with the Nacimiento Formation, which contains fossils of porcine mammals, early placental mammals well established as Paleocene residents. In some areas, these formations intertongue, reinforcing the idea that the entire Ojo-Alamo sequence belongs to the dawn of the Cenozoic. To test this hypothesis, scientists turned to magnetostratigraphy, mapping the magnetic signature of the Ojo-Alamo sandstone. Researchers identified a specific interval of normal polarity known as magnetocron 29N. This cron is a well-known marker of the early Paleocene. The identification of this signature in dinosaur-bearing beds at 6 different localities in the southern San Juan Basin provides independent, non-biological evidence that these rocks were formed after the KPG extinction event. According to this magnetic chronology, the Alamoan fauna was not a single lonely species, but a relatively diverse assemblage including massive duck-billed hadrosaurs, armored ankylosaurs, and even apex predators like Tyrannosaurus rex and Albertorosaurs. A key member of this group was Alamosaurus sanjuanensis, a titanosaur sauropod whose presence in these strata directly challenges the idea of a sudden, universal wipeout of the largest terrestrial animals.
The most compelling piece of evidence for the Alamoan fauna is the discovery of 34 skeletal elements from a single hadrosaur in the Hunter Wash Beryl Spring Arroyo area. This locality is the most extensively studied biostratigraphic area in the basin, and finding a collection of bones from the same individual here is a significant event. It is much more difficult to explain away as a geological fluke than a single isolated bone. If these bones had been washed out of older Cretaceous rocks and reburied in the Paleocene, a process known as reworking, they would likely have been scattered over a wide area and heavily abraded. Instead, these 34 elements were found in close proximity, suggesting they were buried in situ shortly after the animal died. Among these remains was a particularly impressive hadrosaur femur, measuring over 1.1 meters in length and weighing approximately 130 kilograms. The sheer size of such a bone makes it an unlikely candidate for reworking. Moving an object of that mass through a river system without causing significant damage is a physical impossibility. Yet, the bone showed no evidence of the telltale signs of erosion or abrasion expected from the violent forces of a high-energy stream. This led researchers to conclude that the bone was indigenous to the Ojo-Alamo sandstone, meaning the animal lived and died during the time the sediment was being deposited.
To settle the question of whether these bones were original to the layer, scientists employed geochemical analysis. As bones lie buried, they act like chemical sponges, absorbing trace elements from the surrounding groundwater. Over time, they take on a unique chemical signature reflecting their environment. Researchers compared the chemical composition of 15 dinosaur bones from the Ojo Alamo with 15 samples from the underlying Kirtland Formation, which is undisputed late Cretaceous. The results showed a stark contrast. The bones from the two formations contained distinctly different abundances of uranium and rare earth elements. This geochemical fingerprint demonstrates that the Cretaceous and Paleocene bones were mineralized at different times by fluids with different chemical compositions. If the Ojo Alamo dinosaurs had been reworked from Cretaceous layers, they should have carried the same chemical signature as the bones in the Kirtland Formation. The fact that they do not indicates they were buried and mineralized in a separate, later event. This finding provides a powerful scientific rebuttal to the claim that these fossils represent a zombie taxon, reworked fossils appearing in younger strata. However, the idea of Paleocene dinosaurs remains one of the most controversial topics in the field. Many paleontologists are deeply skeptical and point to potential flaws in the evidence. One major point of contention is the placement of the KPG boundary within the San Juan Basin. While Fassett and his colleagues argue the entire Ojo Alamo sandstone is Paleocene, others maintain the boundary lies within the formation itself. They suggest the lower part of the sandstone, the Nashubito member, is still Cretaceous, and that an invisible gap in time known as an unconformity exists between it and the upper Kimbeto member. This unconformity is hypothesized to represent a hiatus of at least 6 million years. Critics argue that the Nashubito member contains the last true Cretaceous dinosaurs, while the overlying Kimbeto member contains only isolated, water-worn fragments reworked from below. Proponents of the survival theory point out that there is little evidence of significant erosion between these layers, which would be expected if 6 million years were missing. They argue that the formations are lithologically distinct and must be separated based on established stratigraphic rules, which would place the boundary at the base of the Ojo Alamo, not within it. The site known as Pot Mesa illustrates this conflict perfectly. At Pot Mesa, researchers initially believed a set of dinosaur bones belonged to the Paleocene. Later, after a re-evaluation of the strata, the line representing the time gap was moved. In the first interpretation, the gap was drawn below the bones. In the second, it was drawn above them. This shifting boundary suggests to some that the unconformity is not a physical reality found in the stones, but a theoretical necessity used to keep dinosaurs on the Cretaceous side of the calendar. The search for an iridium layer, the definitive global marker of the KPG impact, has further complicated the issue. In the San Juan Basin, this layer has proven elusive. Without this chemical beacon, researchers are forced to rely on indirect methods of dating, leading to conflicting interpretations. The controversy also touches on the broader patterns of extinction. Researchers have proposed various survival mechanisms, such as the strategic burial of eggs and nests, which are explored in later chapters. But the primary resistance to the Alamoan fauna often stems from a psychological phenomenon in science. The debate is a classic example of what some scientists call the reinforcement syndrome. This is the tendency for a hypothesis to be repeatedly reinforced by further data, especially if it was developed by a respected authority. A famous previous victim of this syndrome was the 4 Ice Age story, where researchers for decades forced all geological data to fit a model of exactly 4 glaciations, ignoring evidence of many more, because the 4-stage model was so widely accepted. In the case of dinosaurs, the long-held belief that they died out exactly 66 million years ago created a rigid framework. Any fossil contradicting this timeline was often dismissed as reworked or incorrectly dated without further investigation. Despite the skepticism, the combination of Paleocene pollen, magnetic signatures, and unique geochemical profiles creates a compelling case. If these dinosaurs were indeed original to the Paleocene, it would mean that the end of the Mesozoic was not a single sharp cutoff, but a more complex transition involving a Lazarus fauna, species that actually survive a mass extinction. This investigation into the survivors of the San Juan Basin sets the stage for a deeper look at the physical processes that move fossils through time, and the difficult task of distinguishing a genuine resident of an era from a ghost that has been unearthed and reburied.
Chapter 3: The Ghost in the Rock, Reworking and the Lazarus Fauna. In the study of deep time, researchers often encounter a phenomenon known as a zombie taxon. This term describes a fossil that appears to have cheated death, appearing in rock layers deposited long after its species supposedly went extinct. In most cases, these are not true survivors, but geological illusions. They are fossils that were eroded out of their original ancient graves and redeposited into much younger sediment, a process known as reworking. This geological sleight of hand is the primary weapon used by skeptics to dismiss any claim of a dinosaur living in the Paleocene. However, as new evidence emerges from the San Juan Basin and beyond, the distinction between a zombie and a genuine Lazarus fauna, a group that actually survives a mass extinction, has become the most contentious battleground in paleontology. The default assumption that any Paleocene dinosaur must be a reworked fossil is driven by what some scientists call the reinforcement syndrome. This is a psychological and professional phenomenon where a long-accepted hypothesis becomes so entrenched that all new data is forced to fit the existing model. Because the 66 million year boundary is viewed as an absolute wall for non-avian dinosaurs, any bone found above that line is immediately labeled as reworked, often without a thorough investigation of its physical or chemical context. This creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. If every Paleocene dinosaur is dismissed as a zombie by default, the fact that no dinosaurs survived into the Paleocene can never be challenged.
To understand the mechanics of this debate, one must visualize the high-energy environments of the early Cenozoic. A river cutting through a bank of Cretaceous sandstone could easily dislodge a fossilized tooth or a shard of bone. That object, already mineralized and hard as stone, would tumble downstream alongside modern gravel before settling into a new bed of Paleocene mud. To a scientist millions of years later, the bone appears to be a contemporary of the Paleocene mammals found nearby. This is why physical condition has traditionally been the primary criterion for identifying reworking. The logic is simple. A bone that has been washed out and transported should show signs of wear. However, the nuances of this physical evidence are more complex than they appear. Spencer G. Lucas, a prominent researcher of the San Juan Basin, has explicitly noted that abrasion and other physical damage to a fossil is not a definite criterion for reworking. He argues that it is often impossible to determine with certainty whether a fossil has been moved based on its appearance alone. A bone could be transported a short distance in a low-energy stream and remain perfectly preserved, while a bone buried in situ could be crushed or weathered by the weight of the overlying rock. This ambiguity means that the zombie label is often applied subjectively, depending on the researcher's preconceived notions of when the animal should have died.
The case for the Alamoan fauna, the purported Paleocene dinosaur assemblage of New Mexico, rests on evidence that defies the simple reworking narrative. The most significant of these finds is the collection of 34 skeletal elements from a single hadrosaur. In the chaotic process of erosion and redeposition, skeletal elements are almost always scattered. It is statistically improbable that a river could unearth 34 different bones from a single skeleton, transport them, and then redeposit them in a single associated group without losing the majority of the pieces. The presence of such an assemblage strongly suggests that the animal was buried in situ, dying and being covered by sediment exactly where it was discovered. The physical scale of the Alamoan fossils further complicates the reworking theory. Among the remains is a hadrosaur femur of staggering proportions, measuring over 1 meter in length and weighing approximately 130 kilograms. To move an object of this mass, a river would need to act with the force of a catastrophic flood. Such a high-energy environment would leave an unmistakable mark. A bone acting as a massive boulder would be slammed against other rocks, resulting in significant chipping and scouring. Yet, this massive femur shows no such evidence of abrasion. It appears to have been buried quickly and quietly, a preservation style entirely inconsistent with the violent process of being reworked from an older formation.
Because physical appearance is often inconclusive, scientists have turned to the chemical level to distinguish between zombies and indigenous fossils. During fossilization, bones act as chemical sponges, absorbing trace elements from the surrounding groundwater. This creates a geochemical fingerprint unique to the specific environment of burial. In the San Juan Basin, researchers compared the concentrations of uranium and rare earth elements in the purported Paleocene dinosaur bones with those known to be from the Cretaceous. The results revealed a startling distinction. The two sets of bones possessed completely different chemical profiles. If the Paleocene dinosaurs had been washed out of Cretaceous layers, they should have carried the chemical signature of their original home. The fact that they do not indicates they were mineralized for the first time during the Paleocene, providing a powerful chemical argument that these animals are not stone ghosts, but indigenous residents of the Cenozoic. Perhaps the most revolutionary piece of evidence in this debate is the application of direct dating. While most fossils are dated by the rocks they are found in, new techniques have allowed for the direct UPB uranium-lead dating of the bone material itself. In one landmark study, a bone specimen from the San Juan Basin yielded a direct age of 64.8 plus or minus 0.9 million years. This date is critical because it bypasses the entire debate over reworking and stratigraphy. By dating the actual fossilization event, researchers have provided a timestamp that places the death and mineralization of the animal more than 1 million years after the KPG impact. This is the smoking gun for the in situ argument, suggesting that the Alamoan fauna was a genuine Lazarus fauna that persisted well into the dawn of the mammals. This dilemma is not confined to the American Southwest. Tantalizing reports of potential survivors have surfaced globally, often involving specific researchers and locations that challenge the universal extinction model. In the Takatika grid of the Chatham Islands, located in the remote southern Pacific, Dr. Robert A. Long and other researchers have documented dinosaur remains in strata that appear to post-date the extinction event. Similarly, in the Hell Creek Formation of Montana, reports have surfaced of purported Paleocene survivors that include not just teeth and fragments, but specific taxa such as theropods. These finds are often dismissed because they consist of smaller elements, which are easier to rework than a 130-kilogram femur. Yet the consistency of these reports across different continents suggests that the zombie explanation may be a convenient rug under which inconvenient data is swept.
The debate over these fossils often hinges on the mechanism of survival. James E. Fassett, a leading voice for the Paleocene dinosaur theory, has suggested that the term Lazarus fauna is highly appropriate for these creatures. He has proposed that the strategic burial of eggs might have provided a specific mechanism for how these lineages survived the initial thermal pulse and impact winter. While the adults on the surface were decimated, embryos protected underground could have hatched into a world that was already beginning to recover. This egg bank theory suggests that the dinosaurs found in the Paleocene were not the same individuals that witnessed the asteroid strike, but their descendants, emerging from the Earth to reclaim a shattered world. The resistance to the idea of a Lazarus fauna often stems from the high bar of proof required by the scientific community. For many, the only acceptable evidence would be a fully articulated skeleton, where every bone is in its correct anatomical position, found undeniably above a layer of Paleocene mammalian fossils. Until such a find is documented, reworking remains the default safe explanation. However, the combination of associated skeletal elements, a lack of physical abrasion, distinct geochemical signatures, and direct UPB dating creates a cumulative case that is increasingly difficult to ignore. If these bones are indeed indigenous to the Paleocene, it forces a reevaluation of the KPG extinction itself. It suggests that the event was not a clean global guillotine, but a more complex and protracted process. It would mean that for over 1 million years, the Earth was a transitional realm where the last of the Mesozoic giants shared the landscape with the ancestors of modern mammals. The zombie taxon dilemma is therefore more than a technicality of geology. It is a struggle to define the nature of life's resilience. It poses the question of whether we are seeing the recycled remains of a dead world or the final stubborn holdouts of a dynasty that refused to vanish. This investigation into the physical and chemical reality of these fossils sets the stage for exploring the biological and environmental refugia that might have allowed such a survival to occur.
Chapter 4: The Buried Dynasty. One of the most compelling survival mechanisms proposed for late surviving dinosaurs involves the strategic burial of their nests. In the final years of the Cretaceous, many dinosaur species had already evolved complex nesting behaviors, laying eggs in deep burrows or covering them with thick layers of soil, sand, and rotting vegetation to maintain stable temperatures. When the asteroid struck, the immediate heat pulse and global wildfires decimated surface populations. But for an embryo encased in a protective shell and buried several inches underground, the Earth acted as a thermal shield. This egg strategy provides a biological framework for the million-year survival observed in the San Juan Basin, suggesting that dinosaur embryos could have remained in a biological bunker for a period of 1 to 2 years following the impact. Evidence for such persistence is not limited to the American Southwest. Reports of Paleocene survivors have emerged globally, including discoveries in China and the Hell Creek Formation of Montana, where dinosaur remains have been identified as high as 1.3 meters above the KPG boundary. These finds suggest that the transition from the Mesozoic was not a global guillotine, but a multi-year transition where the survival of a species depended on the resilience of its youngest members. When these hatchlings finally emerged, they entered a sick world where the initial fires had died out and the landscape was defined by the post-impact fern spike.
The geography of the planet during this transition created vital refugia, particularly in the high latitudes of the southern hemisphere. In the Paleocene, Antarctica and Australia remained connected via the Tasmanian Gateway and the Weddellian Isthmus. The dinosaurs of these polar regions were evolutionarily prepared for the impact winter.
They were already accustomed to months of seasonal darkness and foraging in twilight. In this context, the silicate dust that reduced sunlight by 80 to 90% was a challenge they were uniquely equipped to navigate. In the speculative evolutionary models of the West Antarctic archipelago, researchers have identified creatures that represent the type of generalists that might have thrived. Antarctolestes, a small paravian weighing less than 0.5 kilograms and measuring 60 centimeters, exemplifies this potential. A semi-aquatic, near-shore animal similar to a modern diving duck, it was a non-migratory resident of the Antarctic interior. While capable of powered flight, it was likely an awkward flyer that relied on bat-like flight strokes. Its semi-aquatic niche was one of the safest places to be, as freshwater ecosystems relied heavily on detritus rather than immediate photosynthesis. The physical adaptations of these survivors were key to their persistence. Some small theropods possessed teeth with serrations spaced farther apart than those of their strictly carnivorous ancestors, a dental anatomy similar to the troodontid Byronosaurus. These wider serrations allowed the animals to process tough plant matter and seeds, energy capsules that remained viable for years in darkness. By becoming generalists, scavengers, and herbivores, these dinosaurs exploited food sources that specialized giants could not.
Another critical trait was the ability to burrow. Small herbivores like Eornithromius provide a plausible model for this fossorial lifestyle, using underground tunnels to escape acid rain and freezing temperatures. These burrows were not just shelters, but the centers of social and reproductive life, providing a stable environment for eggs and increasing the chances that a lineage would continue into the Cenozoic. The speculative fossil record of the early Paleocene also introduces biological mosaics like the armored elasmarian Omegadromius. A recent colonist of western central Antarctica, an area where no herbivores had survived the initial impact winter, this 12 kilograms pioneer was covered in a mix of feathers and bony osteoderms. In the absence of megaraptoran predators, these armored survivors became the new giants of their local ecosystems. Even larger was Eodespotoaves, a creature whose anatomy was specifically tuned for megafaunal growth in a diminished world. Its high neural spines on the tail supported a large fatty and muscled hump, a biological ballast that helped offset its balance as it grew to sizes that dwarfed contemporary mammals. For a few 100,000 years, these last dinosaurs shared the landscape with diversifying mammals and the first giant flightless birds. However, their survival was precarious. In a world with low population densities, the demographic fragility of these groups was a constant threat. The behavior of lekking, where males gather to display fitness, became a high-stakes gamble. If a male and female could not find each other in the vast, quiet landscape, their lineage ended, regardless of their biological resilience. As the Paleocene progressed, the window for these ancient survivors began to close, making way for the rise of the Brawny Successors. Chapter 5. The Rise of the Brawny Successors. The world that emerged several million years after the Great Cataclysm was a lush, steaming greenhouse. By the middle of the Paleocene epoch, the Earth had largely healed its scars, but the biological architecture of the planet had been fundamentally rewritten. The vacancy left by the non-avian dinosaurs was not just a gap in the fossil record, it was a massive opening in the global economy of life. Into this void stepped a caste of survivors that had once lived in the shadows of the Mesozoic giants. This was the era of the Great Reorganization, a time when mammals, birds, and even some remarkably large reptiles vied for dominance in a landscape that was suddenly up for grabs. As these brawny successors claimed the forests and plains, any lingering dinosaurian lineages, such as the controversial Alamoan fauna, would have found themselves in a world increasingly crowded by these robust mammalian pioneers. The environment itself was a testament to this new warmth. Dense forests of palm trees and cacti began to spread into latitudes once too cold for such flora, while the ginkgo genus, a resilient survivor of the Mesozoic, remained a dominant fixture in the canopy.
For the mammals, the first 10 million years of the Cenozoic were defined by an evolutionary strategy that researchers have described as brawn before brains. During the age of dinosaurs, mammals had remained small, rarely exceeding the size of a modern badger, constrained by the predatory pressure of the ruling reptiles. Once that pressure was removed, the mammalian lineage experienced a biological explosion. However, the first wave of this expansion did not focus on intelligence or specialized feeding. Instead, early Paleocene mammals bulked up at a staggering rate, prioritizing sheer physical presence to secure their place in the New World. A study of Asian fossils suggests a specific pattern known as brawn before bite. Mammals first grew significantly larger to fill vacant ecological roles, and only millions of years later did they evolve the specialized teeth and jaw structures required for complex diets. The fossil record grounds this age of mammals in specific evidence, such as Tanyalobus, the largest of the multituberculates. This beaver-sized creature was a heavyweight of the early Paleocene, possessing a robust skull and specialized incisors for gnawing through the tough vegetation of the post-impact world. It represented the first mammalian attempt at megafaunal status, proving that even the most ancient lineages could thrive in the absence of the dinosaurs. In this world, being physically robust was more advantageous than being clever or specialized. One of the most successful groups to emerge during this time was the condylarths. These were primitive, hoofed mammals that served as the generalized ancestors for many modern orders, including the later giants of the Eocene. They were characterized by 44 low-crowned teeth and 5-toed plantigrade feet, primitive traits that would later be lost as their descendants specialized for speed and efficiency. Some were light-bodied herbivores, while others pushed the boundaries of size, filling the niches left by the smaller ornithons of the Cretaceous. By the middle of the epoch, the pantodon set arrived. Creatures like Pantalambda and the even larger Baryolambda represented the first true mammalian heavyweights. These were heavy-bodied herbivores, some reaching the size of a modern bear. They possessed small brain cavities and narrow muzzles, browsing on the dense vegetation that flourished in the absence of the great sauropods. The mammalian radiation was not limited to herbivores. The ecological roles of terrestrial carnivores were being filled by a strange new collection of hunters. The Mesonychids, for example, were a group of hoofed predators that looked like a cross between a wolf and a pig. One genus, Dissacus, was a widespread hunter across Europe, East Asia, and North America. These animals possessed large, powerful jaws and teeth adapted for crushing bone. In an extraordinary twist of evolutionary history, these semi-amphibious predators from Central Asia are believed to be the ancestors of modern whales. Alongside them were the creodonts, another group of early mammalian carnivores that would remain significant predators throughout the Paleogene, utilizing their specialized shearing teeth to dominate the undergrowth.
While the mammals were building their new dynasties, the birds were making a play for the title of apex terrestrial predator. In the late Paleocene, the forests of Europe and North America were dominated by Gastornis, a giant flightless bird that stood over 2 meters tall and weighed as much as 200 kilograms. With its massive hatchet-like beak and powerful legs, Gastornis was a formidable presence, effectively filling the niche once held by small to medium-sized theropods.
The dawn of the Cenozoic reveals a transition far more complex than a simple ending. While the KPG impact remains the most dramatic turning point in Earth's history, the controversial evidence of the Alamoan fauna suggests that the dinosaurian legacy may have flickered on in the shadows of a recovering world. Whether these fossils represent zombie remnants or true Lazarus survivors, they challenge